Good morning, everyone. We are the PMC team, and we're very excited to talk to you about our work calculating Scope 3 GHG emissions for a mid-sized specialty chemical company.
Just to give you a roadmap of our presentation today, we're first going to give you an overview of our capstone, some of our key objectives and where we're picking up from last year's group, and then we're going to move on to cover the importance of Scope 3 emissions and their value and why a company like PMC would want to recruit our group to be able to do this comprehensive report for them. And then we're going to give you an introduction to PMC organometallics, and then a review of the categories that we were able to calculate and some key project takeaways.
So now we would like to introduce our team.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ariane.
Hi, everyone. I'm Juliet.
Hi, I'm Gracie.
Hi, I'm Emily.
And Ari.
Okay, so this is a slide that many of you are familiar with already. In greenhouse gas accounting, there are three main scopes that we work with. Scope 1, which is direct emissions from an organization's operations. Scope 2, which is indirect emissions, usually from purchased electricity, steam, gas, cooling, heating, things like that. And then Scope 3, and that's where we focused our work for this project.
As Carrie mentioned, yes, we all got our certification prior to starting this project in calculating Scope 3 GHG emissions through the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. Based off of this certification, we then took over a project that was started last year, which also worked with PMC and calculated three Scope 3 categories. This year, we decided to see that bar and totally raise it by calculating 6 Scope 3 categories. And through this, we produced specific recommendations tailored to each category, and then through all of this information, produced a standard operating procedure to base future calculations off of.
Yeah, so what is PMC? PMC is a chemical company. PMC is the parent company to PMC Organic Metallics. So Organic Metallics is in Kentucky, and there's 4 categories in PMC Organic Metallics. So FastCat, organotin stabilizers, Renard reagents, and then fine chemicals. Some of the products that come out of these categories are automotive e-coatings, rigid plastics, and PVC pipes.
In terms of data availability, as mentioned, we were picking up from last year's group, so we were able to cover 6 categories that last year's cohort did not delve into as far as calculations, and these categories are Category 1, purchase goods and services, Category 2, capital goods, Category 4, upstream transportation and distribution, Category 5, waste generated in operations, Category 7, employee commuting, and then finally Category 9, downstream transportation and distribution.
Right, so like Emily said, category 1 is purchase goods and services. And basically what this means is all the activities of the organization or the company that we are working for in terms of their purchase goods and services from extraction, production, raw materials. So we are looking at cradle to gate activities. This was a very data intensive category. And what we did in terms of calculation was, first of all, to determine an approach for calculation. There are 3 main approaches for calculating category 1. The first is a spend-based approach. The second is a supplier-based approach. And then the third is an industry average approach. We use the spend-based approach because that was most relevant to our work. And when you're calculating with this approach, what you do is you need the value or the cost of the purchased goods and services. You multiply that with an emission factor, and then you sum that up to total the emissions for the organization. We went further to subcategorize the emissions into 3 broad groups. We divided them into raw materials, services, and then a broader group which was maintenance, consumables, and other things. And we did this so that we could tell which aspects of their value chain was producing the most emissions. And what we realized ultimately was that raw materials was the highest emitting aspect of their supply chain.
So the category 2 is more straightforward than category 1. So what it essentially means, it's indirect emissions associated with the long-term assets of a company that uses to produce their products or services, which kind of means their indirect emissions associated with their buildings, machinery, factory, and those kind of large-term assets. So to calculate category 2, we also use spend-based method. So we first identify the total amount of the amount spent for the project, and identify the emission factor that goes with the project or industry average, which also gives us the total emissions associated with our category 2.
Yeah, so category 4 is all of the upstream transportation and distribution. So all of the raw materials coming into the Kentucky plant from the supplier location. It's really important to calculate we use the distance-based method, but it's really important to consider each leg of the transportation, as there's different emission factors applied throughout the entire transportation.
So now looking at category 5, waste generated in operations. So for this particular category, we determined that the waste type specific method was the best route and most straightforward way to calculate. And for this specific method, we looked at the waste produced in metric tons and then multiplied that by a customized emission factor that we came up with based off the amount of hazardous chemical in the waste product produced. And then we used this to generate total emissions. Specifically for this category, we were looking at emissions coming from waste through incineration primarily, as other waste treatment methods weren't really generating carbon emissions. And then, as I mentioned previously, we were using customized emission factors based on data that we had from our sponsor, looking at the molecular weight of the hazardous chemical, specifically in the waste produced, to then determine the carbon content. For this particular category, the emissions factors were very, very small, as we were just focusing on the hazardous chemical present in the waste produced. And then comparably to other categories, the emissions were pretty small. And then for all other waste produced, where we weren't able to get data on the amount of hazardous chemical in the waste product, we just use an IPCC standardized emission factor.
So the next category we looked at is employee commuting. As you can probably infer, employee commuting looks at the emissions produced from employees commuting to and from work each day. With this in mind, we also used the distance-based method, which included looking at the number of employees the number of employees commuting to and from the plant each day. We also looked at how many days they're traveling to and from the plant, and also, of course, keeping in mind that they're traveling to and also from the plant. With this in mind, we also looked at the distance that they lived between the plant, took this amount in kilometers, and multiplied it by the number of times that they were traveling in a year, and then multiplied it by an emissions factor for automobiles provided by the EPA. This was under the assumption that all PMC employees are traveling by car. This category, what makes it different from other categories, it's really reliant on employee engagement and is incredibly lifestyle-centric. Employees have the options and the choice to decide how they commute to work and when they commute to work. So in calculating this category, it's incredibly reliant on employee engagement and their compliance.
Yeah, so category 9 is very similar to category 4, but this is just the downstream transportation and distribution. So all of the products that PMC Organic Metallics is producing going to their customers. Also, another thing that's very important, getting the latitude and longitude for each of the locations is critical to calculate this distance to obviously apply the correct emission factor. Something unique about this category is there's 394 unique locations, and that's around 23 different countries that we had to look at all those different locations.
So as Carrie mentioned, taking on this project was just a little more challenging than doing the certification. It required filtering through thousands of data points, many of which were unsorted, and so this was a huge time commitment in terms of filtering through all of this. However, with cleaning through all of this data, we see a huge opportunity for AI agents in simplifying this process and making it more efficient for future calculations. Additionally, through collecting all of this data and tracking down suppliers and just data sheets, we found throughout this process that supplier and employee engagement is key to ensuring the future of these calculations. Thank you so much for listening.